Good evening. Thank you for tuning in to our virtual Planning Commission meeting tonight, February 16th. We will continue to follow the county orders to shelter in place and practice safe social distancing due to the threat of the novel coronavirus COVID-19. As a reminder, items will be taken in the order they are listed on the agenda. Before we get started, I wanted to briefly go over public comment procedures for the meeting for those who may have joined us for the very first time. All public comment on items not on tonight's agenda will be taken during general public comment, which is item number 3 on this evening's agenda. Comments on other agenda items will be taken only when that item is called. You can use the raise hand feature on Zoom to speak. If you are joining the teleconference by phone, you may raise your hand by dialing *9 and then *6 to unmute your microphone when prompted. Please only raise your hand at the time when the item on which you wish to speak is called. Each speaker is allotted approximately 3 minutes, although this time will vary if we get a large number of speakers. Lastly, we know that each one of us brings a different perspective to the discussion, so we ask that everyone be respectful of each other and let someone speak without being interrupted. Thank you for your attention and consideration to this process. So if we could go ahead and have roll call, please.
Yes, thank you. I will start with the Planning Commission. Commissioner Schmidt.
Here.
Commissioner Bondano.
Here.
Commissioner Shu. Commissioner Shu, are you there? I see that you're unmuted, but I can't hear you for some reason. Okay, I'll keep going, then we'll come back and try again. Commissioner Martinez?
Here.
Commissioner Meunier?
Here.
Vice Chair Hunter?
Here.
Chair Radcliffe?
Here.
And Commissioner Shu, let's see if we can hear you now. Okay, we'll try one more time after the Architectural Advisory Committee. Okay, I will go now to the roll call for the AAC. Committee Member Roth?
Present.
Committee Member Stewart?
Here.
Committee Member Tanaka-Subo?
Here.
Vice Chair Feniger?
Present.
And Chair Spatorno?
Here.
And I see that Commissioner Shu signed back in, so let's try one more time. Commissioner Shu?
Yes, present. Sorry about that. Zoom switched some kind of a default on me and wouldn't let me use my computer speaker microphone.
Okay.
So I had to log out or leave the meeting and come back in.
Well, we can hear you now, so I'm glad that it's working.
Fixed for the rest of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, for the purposes of the teleconference, I'll also state that my name is Anna McGill, Principal Planner and Staff Liaison to the Commission, and the other city staff that are attending this meeting are William Chu, Senior Planner, Apollo Rojas, Senior Planner, Pristana Risaya, Senior Assistant City Attorney, and Christina Mateo, Administrative Secretary and Meeting Host.
Great, thank you. Next on our agenda is approval of the minutes, but we do not have minutes for this meeting, from a previous meeting for this meeting to approve. So we will go on to public comment. And this is the time when you can make a comment on anything that is not on the agenda or on the consent calendar. So following the procedural change for public comment in line with City Council hearings, we will no longer read written comments into the record. We will take public comment from those joining us through Zoom first. If you have logged into Zoom through your computer, please click the raise hand button now. If you have dialed in, please enter *9 now. If you had dialed in, you may begin speaking once you are signaled that your audio has been unmuted. In order to see how many speakers we have for general public comment, I ask that everyone who wishes to speak during consent calendar item or on an item not on the agenda, please raise your hand now. So I'm not seeing any hands being raised. Okay. Last chance. Okay, we will next go on to consent calendar. There are no items on our consent calendar, which leads us into our study session. This is a study session on the draft single-family residential guidelines for the Architectural Advisory Committee. Recommendation is for the Planning Commission and Architectural Advisory Committee to provide feedback on the draft residential design guidelines. No formal action or recommendation will occur at this meeting. Do we have a staff presentation?
Yes, we do. Thank you very much, Chair Radcliffe. Good evening to the Planning Commission.
William, I can hardly hear you.
All right, let me try again. Give me a second. Okay, is that any better?
It certainly is, yes. Thank you.
Very good. So once again, thank you and good evening to the Planning Commission and the Architectural Advisory Committee. My name is William Chu. I'm the project planner for the Design Guidelines Project, and I'll be presenting tonight with Monica Sidlick, who is the city's consultant, and we'll be presenting the second draft of the single-family residential design guidelines for tonight's study session. Next slide, please. So here's how we're going to split the presentation. I'm just going to very briefly provide the background of this project, how we got here, and then I'll turn it over to Monica to talk about the changes to the design guidelines from draft 1 to draft 2, and then to go through the design guidelines themselves. And then back to conclude, we'll go back to staff to provide some context on how the design guidelines will be used for project review, talk about what the next steps are, and then go through some of the policy questions that we're looking to get input on tonight to get the design guidelines to a good place and ready for adoption. So next slide, please. So yeah, once again, just very quickly, the background of why we're here, why we're working on design guidelines at all. To start, we do want to make it very clear that the design guidelines apply for single family home design reviews only, not any other type of residential structures or ADUs. And the reason we're focusing on single family design is because over the last few years, the city's heard a number of concerns regarding new homes, the size, the bulk, and the mass, especially as they compare to existing homes and neighboring homes in the area. And so based on this feedback, the city council directed staff to review how single family homes are processed and provide more tools to evaluate these type of projects, so new homes and second story additions. And there's been a number of steps taken in the last 3 years. Number one is the adoption of guiding principles for neighborhood compatibility. This document describes how to evaluate massing in context and the neighborhood context. The second is the adoption of a floor area ratio ordinance, which limited homes to 3,000 square feet or 45% floor area ratio, whichever is the higher number. And then finally, number three, which is the ongoing project and why we're here tonight, which is the comprehensive design guidelines for single family homes. Next slide, please. So this project started in August of 2019 with the hiring of Lisa Wise Consulting to work with staff and do community outreach and the development of the guidelines. And as I did mention, Monica from Lisa Wise will do the other half of the presentation. The first step they did was a very robust and extensive community outreach effort. The results of this outreach was presented to Planning Commission last year in February, and all the feedback from the community, the different study sessions that we did, some meetings with interested parties were all incorporated into a draft of the design guidelines. And in November of last year, 2020, we presented that first full draft to the Planning Commission and the AAC at a study session similar to what we're doing tonight, and asked for input on whether we were on the right track and what was missing. And just to summarize some of the comments and recommendations that we reviewed is to simplify the organization of the document, to provide more clarity on applicability and how the document would be used, and then prioritize flexibility, and then prioritize elements that contributed to the street frontage and how a home is viewed from the street and the public right of way, and then to look at not requiring consistency with an existing neighborhood pattern, which was thought was too rigid. And then lastly, of course, was to return with a revised draft for review in a joint study session. Next slide, please. So just very quickly, before turning it over to Monica and our consultants, what I want to do is provide just a preview of the policy questions that we included in the staff report so that the Planning Commission, the AC, can keep these topics and themes in mind as the presentation continues. So number one, of organization, are the revised guidelines easier to understand and easier to use? And we'll talk about the new organization shortly. Flexibility, does the revisions, is there enough flexibility built in? Is the concentration on the frontage enough guidelines to emphasize design of the frontage? Do the design guidelines for building and massing address the city and community's concerns for two-story homes? And then the diagrams and photos, which have also been updated, do they provide good examples of the guidelines? And then, obviously anything else and any additional topics or guidelines that should be included, and if we're missing anything. These are all questions that we'll revisit at the end, but things to keep in mind as I turn it over to Monica to talk about the new draft.
Thank you, William, and hello, everyone. William, if it's okay with you, I'm going to share my screen so I can use the presentation that I've got here. Oh,
sorry, Monica. Only the host is sharing screen, so I think
host is sharing.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, no problem. Then we'll move on to the next slide. So good evening, everyone, and we're glad to be back before this joint group again. As William mentioned, we've revised the October draft of the design guidelines based on your feedback, and we're happy to present it to you again tonight. So I'll provide just a very brief introduction on the project and process because we just spoke about that recently. So I'll sort of fly through this. The project objectives, this means, so responding to community concerns, so identifying the range of concerns that have been raised during hearings and appeals, as well as any other issues about design that the community raised during the outreach phase of the project. Find a way to respond adequately and fairly. Encourage context-based high-quality design. A big part of this is determining what that means throughout Redwood City. Reflect sound design principles and best practices on a lot-by-lot basis. This means considering each house on its own merit. How do we define and encourage best practices for Redwood City? Ensure transparency, certainty, flexibility, and finality in the process. So basically to achieve a community-wide awareness of the shared goals, reduce surprises, and to be user-friendly. Next slide, please. So we started out by conducting a residential design study that documented the range of home types found in different areas of the city and identified patterns of existing conditions and design elements. We also looked at plans that have been reviewed and changes that have been requested by the city during approval processes to get a sense of the direction that staff and the commission have been, to get a sense of the direction they've been moving in. And we noted what we saw as trends on the part of proposals and priorities on the part of staff and the neighboring community. Next slide. We conducted a series of outreach events over a period of about 6 months. So this included information gathering, interviews with residents, designers and architects, professional builders. We talked about all of these the last time we met, and basically about how we created a range of events to provide as many opportunities as possible for the community to lend input. Next slide. So we documented all the community feedback we received into these reports. So we'll just do a quick look at that feedback. We found that feedback fell into 5 categories. You can move on to the next slide. So looking at feedback about overall design considerations, we heard that there's a general appreciation for design that respects neighboring homes and for diversity in design. We heard that it's a problem when the various elements of design don't seem to come together or don't contribute to the street character, or when building details and elements don't reflect any particular or recognizable style. We heard a lot of words like overpower and overcrowd. Many responses referenced context and a desire for houses that fit in. So in general, we saw that the community noted tension between diversity and compatibility. They also saw a tension between preservation and preservation of typical styles in the city that have developed over time and exhibiting contemporary trends and styles. Community members talked a lot about porches and other entryway features and a continuous visibility between the street and the private realm is needing to be encouraged. Since the guidelines are about perception from the right of way, we heard about priorities. We heard about landscaping, paving, screening, visual dominance or impact of all of these items. We heard that landscaping should soften and add depth to the front setback and facade. We heard about the need for additions to respect the original structure. Some community members thought of building scale and mass as ways to incorporate upper story setbacks while avoiding like a wedding cake effect. Preserving daylight and privacy while retaining the flexibility that designers and property owners currently have. And people notice that when 2 adjacent homes have very different story heights, it can have the effect of making one house sort of dwarf the other. So everything else and all of the specifics of design, including articulation of the facade and coherence of design elements that make up a facade, and the relationship between the design of the building envelope and the massing and the program within these spaces, these are the sort of things we heard from the community. So the design guidelines draw on all of these, and you should see as I go through each guideline how we sort of address all of these concerns. So let's move on to the next slide. So here we'll talk about we'll go through the document that's in your packet. So as you know, we've met 2 times before. We introduced a table of contents in February of last year. We went on hold for a bit. Then we presented the draft design guidelines to you in November, and we got a lot of really good and constructive feedback from all of you, and thank you for that. And we have a revised draft that's in your packet. So as we go through these, you'll see these orange boxes on the bottom of the screen, which identify, just sort of point out the major changes between the draft that we last reviewed and this draft. So the table of contents has been rearranged. So the big changes are that we removed primary and secondary guidelines at your recommendation, and we removed the patterns chapter, and instead arranged the guidelines by topic, as you see here on this slide. So on the issue of patterns, which was a topic of discussion in November, while we removed the patterns chapter, the document still retains content about patterns that we understood there was a desire where, based on our findings, we understood sort of a desire to retain that pattern. So the first 2 chapters open with a narrative discussion about patterns that are expressive of that particular topic. So that is to say, some patterns of building massing and building design found throughout the city's single-family neighborhoods. So each section identifies these 2 chapters, it identifies some salient patterns, but that list of patterns is not exhaustive. It's meant to help designers and applicants be cognizant of and help them notice the impact of patterns on their design. And each of those narrative sections concludes with text to the effect of other building massing patterns exist in residential neighborhoods throughout Redwood City. Applicants are advised to identify any existing patterns and demonstrate how the proposal is compatible. So in general, you could say that the guidelines seek to maintain these patterns and to use them as a sort of expression, a sort of grounding for expression of individuality in home design without limiting designers. We also changed the landscape design chapter to a sort of a guide to landscape design. Next chapter or slide. So we'll start with the introduction. Let's move on to the next slide. So the introduction points out the general plan goals the document is intended to implement. The introduction discusses the purpose of the document. It points out that not every guideline will apply to every project, but that together the guidelines establish a robust set of design expectations for all single-family residential design throughout the city. So let's move on to the next slide. So moving through the document, building massing. The building massing chapter addresses, first, as I mentioned before, it talks about patterns, and then it addresses height and scale in two-story forms. So let's go on to the next slide. So this is the sort of narrative identifying patterns. This section points a few out. Two-story homes in the Stambach Heller neighborhoods that establish a pattern of one-story volumes at the front setback. Hillside homes that exhibit a rhythm of volumes and entrance features. And patterns of streetscape that soften the appearance of the street-facing garages. So let's move on. So beginning with the guidelines here, height and scale. The guidelines seek to sort of encourage projects to maintain floor heights similar to those of neighboring homes and to avoid exaggerated heights. And introduces strategies to encourage designers to lower the perceived height and maintain the scale of neighboring homes. Next slide. We introduced guidelines about locating second-story volumes, about achieving a human-scaled facade, and about encouraging side stepbacks. So that is to say, not setbacks from the property line, but rather stepbacks from the ground floor facades on the front and the side. A difference here, a change between the November draft and this is that we've essentially retooled some graphics to show a sort of scale of desirability in building massing to help designers sort of think through the effect of these design choices. Next slide. We have guidelines to encourage designers to limit complexity in design and to retain the primary form of the house so that additions do not obscure, but rather enhance the original form. And some guidelines lend sort of best practice guidance to do this gracefully. So the next slide is the building design slide. As I mentioned before, we begin with a narrative about patterns in building design, and then have sort of 4 topics related to building design and design guidelines about each of those. And so the next slide summarizes the patterns, the sort of pattern section, and shows some images of continuous horizontal eave lines, for example, in the Friendly Acres neighborhood, detached garages that are typical in older neighborhoods and in areas with large lots. Detached garages located at the rear of the lot in Edgewood Park. And attached garages that are set back from the primary facade. And design guidelines, next slide, begin with facade design. Guidelines encourage applicants to be aware of how elements of facade design come together, and point out best practices and desired effects like creating shadows and visual relief. The guidelines point out that elements of design should be appropriate in scale with the whole building, consistent across the different facades of the building, and lend integrity to the overall design. Next slide. Move on to the next slide. I'm a little distracted by the fact that there's some images that appear on the right of the screen. Is that just me, William, or there's some sort of leftovers from another slide on the right of the screen?
Yeah, it does look like there's a bit of a lag. I think it'll.
Oh, it's a lag.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try not to be distracted by it anymore. Okay. So moving on through the building design chapter, the next section is about transitional spaces, or the spaces that create the shared community living space that we talked about last year. And these are especially important parts of neighborhood design, as we know. So we developed guidelines that encourage these spaces to be in scale with the rest of the building, to provide usable space, to be consistent in style with the rest of the home, and integral to the overall design rather than sort of tacked on. Next slide. So this is sort of similar design guidelines here. Guidelines that encourage well-designed transitional spaces that enforce eyes on the street that you want in any neighborhood, and that include sort of formal elements that help tie the space together. Next slide. Roof form is an integral part of building design that we heard a lot about from the community. The guidelines encourage forms that lend character to the home, that match the overall style of the home, and that don't weigh down the perception, the home as perceived from the right of way. So illustrations point out examples of well-designed roof compositions. Next slide. So similar with garage design, this was very much on the community's mind. We heard a lot about the importance of this space and its usability, but also how the design of the garage can compromise the comfort and the appeal of a streetscape. So guidelines encourage applicants to be consistent with patterns of garage placement, as we discussed, and also to employ strategies that de-emphasize the garage door from the right of way. And the next slide provides some additional examples of garage door design. All right, next slide. Chapter 4 is building details. So we looked at building materials, window placement, and architectural details. So let's move on to the next slide. So we have some examples of sort of palettes of harmonious building materials and colors, and some general best practice to avoid excessive arrangement of materials and colors, and strategies to employ materials and colors to help the overall composition of the home. Next slide. Similar guidelines for window design and placement to sort of avoid, to lend guidance to designers so that these kinds of details appear high in quality and not eccentric, and are consistent with the overall design and style of the home. Protecting privacy and matching the wall spaces behind. And the next slide shows some additional diagrams and guidelines about windows. And the next slide, and the next two slides really, introduce guidelines about details, essentially encouraging the use of details and the incorporation of details that is consistent with the overall design of the home. And so moving on to the next chapter, the last two chapters are sort of guides to landscape design and architectural styles. So landscape design, we've included several illustrations that help identify elements of landscape design that really make a difference to the perception of the front setback area from the right of way, and help to create a comfortable streetscape. So the illustrations and the leaders help point out elements that help establish patterns of landscape and the various features of landscape design in a front setback. So the next slide shows two guidelines. This chapter is limited to two guidelines. Essentially maintain landscaping and incorporate new landscaping to create outdoor spaces. And a variety of specific guidance about landscaping. And the next slide shows guidelines that encourage designers to introduce landscaping that is related to the home and the public spaces, to the entryway spaces, to the transitional spaces, landscape that frames the key elements of the facade, and that essentially helps create a welcoming and usable space. Next slide is more diagrams to demonstrate the use of space in the front setback, paving, and including paving and walls. The last chapter is a guide to architectural styles. So the guidelines for the last chapter are limited to where an existing structure exhibits a particular style, design additions in the same style, and essentially to avoid pastiche. And that chapter, I can move on to the next slide. So this chapter includes a half a page or so about a handful of styles that are traditionally found in Redwood City, and provides sort of a brief description of that style and a short list of design elements that are that will help demonstrate that style. And the point of this chapter is that if you have a house that demonstrates a particular style, a second story addition should sort of follow the same rules. So that's sort of a summary of the draft in your packet, and I will turn the presentation back over to William to lead the discussion about this document.
All right, thank you very much, Monica. Just to wrap up, I want to do two things. One is I want to provide more information about how staff is anticipating we're going to use the guidelines, when and where it's applicable, and then two, detail next steps and how the design guidelines fit into the overall single-family home process. So at the last study session, there were questions about how the design guidelines would be utilized. So the first thing is, I'll stress again that these guidelines are for new two-story homes and second-story additions. Those are where these guidelines are applicable to those projects. But so first, we do see the design guidelines as a proactive document. They provide clear guidance prior to any formal application. Staff many times would have informal conversations with architects and homeowners considering a project, and the design guidelines would be presented as a reference for the city's design priorities and expectations as they would be adopted by the Planning Commission and the City Council. It also provides transparency to a homeowner and the architect, and that this is how the project will be reviewed, and here are the ways to have a successful project. And then, of course, centrally, it will be used during formal project review. After an application is received, the guidelines would supplement objective development standards such as height, lot coverage, and setbacks. So for any typical design review project, staff would review, does it meet setbacks? Is it under the maximum height, etc.? Those type of things. Those are objective numerical standards. But now with this document, staff would also have to evaluate a single family home project against each design guideline to determine, one, does the project comply with each. We would go through a checklist of each individual guideline. Does the project comply, yes or no? Or it could be that the guideline doesn't apply at all to this project. It's important to note that every project is definitely different, and not all guidelines are going to be applicable to each project. So after you go through this checklist, staff would then inform the applicant if a project is inconsistent with whatever guidelines it is, and provide recommendations and an opportunities to revise the project. Of course, we'll go through this exercise again once resubmitted, reviewing that modified project to make sure it's consistent with the design guidelines again. And then once staff is comfortable the project does substantially comply with the guidelines, we would be able to recommend approval of that home project. And in order to approve this type of project, an architectural permit is the entitlement that they would need to get. And so we would also utilize these guidelines to revise the architectural permit findings. What we do now is that new two-story single family homes, second-story additions, these require this architectural permit. It's a design review and evaluates single family home projects and the findings that need to be made in order to approve this permit. These findings are subjective. It deals with design, architectural compatibility, things like that. And so what we would also do is we would revise the architectural permit findings that we have right now and reflect the policies and topics of the design guidelines. And staff would only be able to recommend approval of a project if that project would comply with the design guidelines. And we may recommend denial if a project can't meet these findings and can't these revised findings to show that they're consistent with these new guidelines. So this study does focus on the draft of the design guidelines, but we will bring for further discussion these potential changes to the architectural permit findings to the Planning Commission this year. Next slide, please. So for the guidelines themselves, we're going to incorporate the feedback received from tonight into a final draft, which we brought back to the Planning Commission for adoption. At that same time, we will also present a draft of the revised architectural permit findings This will give the Planning Commission the ability to review and provide comments on these new findings for approval and to see exactly how it would relate to the design guidelines. And then on a separate track, staff is also developing will develop comprehensive zoning code updates to the single family home review process. These would include things like updates to development regulations, potentially changes to the single family home review process, an evaluation of the floor area ratio ordinance, and all of these comprehensive updates will also be brought back to the Planning Commission later this year. So next slide, please. Okay, so with that, I'll put the discussion questions for the Planning Commission and AC back on the screen. Questions about the organization, flexibility, the design guidelines from building and massing, building frontage, and then any discussion on diagram and photos. That concludes the presentation for tonight, and definitely staff and Monica are happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you very much, William and Monica, for your wonderful presentation. Are there any clarifying questions from either commission or committee members? If you could raise your hand, and I see Ernie has raised his hand. Ernie?
Thank you, Chair Radcliffe. Just a quick question for William. When you were talking about the designs being subjective, are we talking about the design guidelines as a whole being subjective, and all we can really do is recommend to the applicants what we would like to see out of that, but at the end of the day, they really have their own choice of being able to design what they want. I'm trying to understand that part of it.
Yeah, certainly. So design in itself is subjective, right? So the way that we're thinking about that is, for an example, if there are concerns with the building massing, there are design guidelines that address, certain like elements of the building massing, but it doesn't necessarily need to. There are many ways that issue could be addressed. So it doesn't necessarily have to be exactly as the design guideline says to address it. There are multiple ways to do it, and so that's where the subjectivity comes in. But we would still ask that if we had concerns over the massing or whatever it is, that it would be revised.
All right, thank you.
If I may, through the chair, can I just clarify really quickly? Because I think what Commissioner Schmidt was asking is sort of the teeth that the guidelines have. Just remember that they'll still be linked to the architectural permit findings. So we'll return with revised findings. And those findings will say something like, does the project substantially comply with the residential guidelines? So we'll still have a finding that we can make. And if we don't feel like the project does comply with the residential design guidelines, then we can, staff can recommend that the project not be approved on that basis. So there'll be some link to the architectural permit findings. It's a little different than the development standards. The development standards, as William said, are objective. So height, 28 feet, you cannot go above that. But the residential design guidelines are policy. So they're a little bit more subjective in nature. And there's a little bit more room, I would say, than the development standards to make an interpretation of what is substantial conformance. Hope that helps.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next, John Spatorno.
Just to clarify, so if I'm an applicant and get a negative or non-compliance from staff level, do I still have the opportunity to address my case in front of the Planning Commission or appeal my case?
I mean, absolutely, but that first review, I think, is what you're saying, where you get comments back that say the proposed project is inconsistent with the following, whatever guidelines.
Right.
There's opportunity. We would provide suggestions on how to bring these certain elements into compliance or consistency, and there would be multiple opportunities for a project to be revised before any decision is made. And so ultimately, yes, if a project is recommended to be denied and it is denied, then there is an appeal process to Planning Commission, yes.
Thank you.
Great. I see no other committee or commissioner questions. So next we will go on to open the public hearing. If there are any members of the public that would like to make comments, I will look for your raised hands at this point. And okay, I have 2 raised hands. We'll call on Ms. Rachel Holt first. Rachel, you have 3 minutes to make your public comment. And I need you to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Now I got you.
Okay, thank you. To the commission and the committee, thank you so much for all of the work that you are doing tonight. It's been nearly 15 years since I began my 9-year tenure on the Planning Commission. And I would bet money that you are all still hearing the same questions from friends and neighbors that I used to get all the time. How on earth did that get approved? The answer, because our current zoning permits it, was not satisfying to me or the questioner. In the 15 years that have passed since I first served, the desirability of Redwood City, we've been discovered, so to speak, as well as the makeup of the planning department, previously consisting of old timers who had lived the majority of their lives in Redwood City and were intimately familiar with the historical influences and nuances of our varied neighborhoods, has changed significantly. Unfortunately, our zoning has not, and we are now playing catch up. I'm very pleased that the city has finally made this a priority, and I beg you all to do the work to make these design guidelines meaningful and robust. Our neighborhoods need them desperately. There are a number of concerns I have about the guidelines as currently drafted, but recognize my time is limited. So I'll just address a couple here tonight. First off, detached garages. As written, the design guidelines ignore the existing guiding principles that promote detached garages. It should be stated first and foremost that where neighborhoods and block patterns evidence a predominant trend in detached garages, for all the positives they bring, including adherence to historical styles, detached garages should be the default. Second, the importance the design guidelines must play in retaining and preserving character, particularly for the historic and historical influenced areas whose architecture significantly contributes to Redwood City's sense of place, history, and beauty in ways more contemporary design do not. Along those lines, there should be a guideline specifically speaking to historical valued neighborhoods that promotes preservation of architecturally significant and contributing older homes, whereby street frontage portions are retained and preserved, while allowing partial second-story additions for the needed space behind the front facade. And for those of you who think it can't be done, please come look at my house anytime. There are reasons that city after city on the peninsula have taken significant steps to preserve the character of their historic and historical influence neighborhoods, and why those neighborhoods are more often than not the jewel of the said city's crown. This is your opportunity to preserve Redwood City's jewels. Don't miss it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Ms. Holt. Next we have Chris Johnson. Chris, you need to unmute, and Rachel, you need to mute.
Oh, how do I mute myself now? Let me see.
Good job.
Sorry, I was waiting for the little button to pop up that council usually sends, but I guess I had to do it myself. Good evening, Planning Commission, Architectural Advisory Committee. My name is Chris Johnson. I'm a resident of Redwood City. Thank you for those of you who responded to my email that was sent earlier today. The house in my neighborhood is the poster child for why we need residential design guidelines. Without fail, whenever I receive a phone call, and I receive many, or an inquiry about that house, like Rachel, the first question is always, how did that get approved? It was approved over 3 years ago because the house checked all the boxes. We had no design standards, and we didn't even have a practical limit on home size. And if a neighbor was concerned about the project, it was an expensive, time-consuming, and divisive undertaking. Ironically, this house could still get approved today because we still have no design guidelines, and we do not have a hard cap FAR ordinance. So thank you very much for your much needed efforts on this issue to date. Developers and homeowners deserve certainty when it comes to planning for a new home. But planning without a plan is what led us to the 4,200 square foot Federalist style home in what some may argue is a historic neighborhood. Other cities have on the peninsula have proven that good design guidelines work. The guidelines before you this evening still need some work, and I echo the concerns put by Rachel earlier in her presentation. And I support everything that she said. And I'm anxious to hear the feedback from the two bodies this evening. So thanks again for your effort on this, and I'm looking forward to the day when we can adopt design guidelines for all of Redwood City. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I had a hand up and it has disappeared. And it was Isabella Chu. There you are. Your hand went back up. All right, Isabella, sorry.
Yeah, no, so first of all, I wanted to thank staff for what's obviously a huge amount of work that has gone into these. And, I certainly, love history and architecture as much as the next person. When we renovated our home, I ordered custom tile that was in the original 1946 colors. We did our siding in the original 1950s, kind of whatever they painted it. The blue they painted it. So for sure, I appreciate the sort of love of history and tradition. But I think it's really important to remember as we think about these things that the purpose of housing is to house people. And that, certainly we can have reasonable design guidelines that encourage beautiful, harmonious places. But they should never sort of impede the primary purpose of housing, which is to allow people to live in a place as affordably and sustainably as possible. And none of the things you propose look like they're particularly onerous. But as we think about these things, I think it's really important to stay away from anything which is arbitrary or subjective, and anything which would put an undue burden or cost on somebody hoping to build more or new housing. So those are my only two concerns. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Chu. Next, I have Adrian Brandt. Adrian, if you'd like to unmute yourself and.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Can everyone hear me?
Sure can.
Thanks. Yeah, so a couple observations. The detached garage issue is interesting. Mount Carmel has a lot of that. And it's because the neighborhood's old. And in the old days, people had horses and carriages and things like that. And I suspect the reason why we had detached garages harkens back to those days where you didn't want the livestock adjacent to your house and so forth. The issue, I just make the observation sort of in line with Isabella Chu's point about the automobile, is if we require detached garages, what that generally means is that the garage is all the way at the rear of the property. If you take the standard 50-foot frontage, it means that, and you have a 10-foot driveway, it means you're blowing 20% of your lot size devoted to automobile storage. Those long driveways are space that could be used for housing people, gardening, recreation, landscaping, numerous things that would be better than a long approach, very long approach with 135-foot deep lots in some cases to a small garage or even a two-car garage all the way at the rear of the property. So it's incredibly wasteful. And the other point I just wanted to make is, overall, this is an exercise in sort of preserving, things the way they always were. I like eclectic design. I don't have a problem with creative new designs. And all of us, it's very subjective, obviously. I mean, at some point it becomes kind of maybe too much or too large or whatever it is. But I just want us to be careful not to shut down. You know, there's many neighborhoods with, you know, in Palo Alto and around the peninsula where you have a lot of sort of cutting edge designs, and they actually look quite nice and they grow on me. I don't know what the rest of you, but things evolve, things can change. And so I don't want to sort of, I'm a little reticent to the frozen in amber approach that everything should remain exactly as it is forever and ever, and we're going to codify that into law. So I just want to be careful of that. And there was another point. Yeah, the other one just has to do with, you know, obviously we don't want to devote too much space to automobiles, so the deep garage is not a good deal. And then we just want to be sure that we allow eclectic things. And the last most important point, and I think Isabella, you hit it as well, is I'm really bothered by subjectivity. And when people appeal to planning commission or to city council and it's the court of public opinion, I'm very bothered by the point that always gets raised about, well, is the family doing it or is the developer doing it? It shouldn't matter. That doesn't seem appropriate to me. We should have rules where everybody can figure out, does it pass or doesn't it? And when you get subjectivity into it, it becomes a popularity contest with how many neighbors support you and how good of a job, you know, if they're immigrants, maybe they're not as popular, if they're a different race or a different class. I think we usually have to be very mindful of that aspect. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. I have Miss Zink. If you would like to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Hi, sorry. My first name's Carol, but
hi, Carol.
I teach online, so that's why my Zoom presence is Ms. Zink. I don't want my students calling me Carol. So I think this is a tough issue for everybody because, and I thank the Planning Commission for the detailed work that you've put into thinking through the issues. I live in Mount Carmel in an old house built in 1928 with a detached garage. And I hadn't thought about the idea of, gosh, all that driveway space that could be planted in flowers instead or whatever. But what we don't want is these massive, close to the sidewalk snout houses with the garage so dominant on the front as to be really quite obnoxious. And I think returning to an issue that Chris Johnson mentioned of the Planning Commission and the City Council, I suppose, working hard to really codify into law that 45% FAR instead of just a suggestion, make it a requirement, I think would go a long way to helping out the neighborhoods and avoid these massive overbuilt houses that, you know, leave a postage stamp sized piece of grass that you could water by spitting on it. So, and I agree with the last speaker that you don't need to have a neighborhood frozen in time, that not all the houses on the block have to look like my 1928 house. In fact, across the street from me, there's 2 brand new houses and they actually look quite nice, but they're set quite far back from the sidewalk, and they took care to adhere to a lot of the suggestions in what you just presented to us in terms of roof line and style and so forth. So I don't agree with the last speaker that you can remove all subjectivity. I don't think you can do that. I don't think it's at all possible. I do think the more firm your guidelines are, the less there's going to be of this, well, how many neighbors like it and how many neighbors don't like it. So I appreciate the efforts that you're putting into this, and I'll yield the rest of my time. Thank you.
Thanks. We appreciate your comments. Next, I have Adam Brown. Adam, if you could unmute yourself.
Sure. It's actually Natasha Bach on Adam's computer. But yeah, I wanted to, I think, reiterate a lot of what Carol and Adrian said. I love a funky, artistic, new design. I'm not super I love that we're having creativity in the neighborhood. I do not love it when they're these enormous looming things. And, you know, when I look next door or I look what's going up catty corner from my home, it looks like my house is a dollhouse next to, you know, some supersized, frankly, tract home that looks devoid of character and really out of place in terms of how big and overwhelming it is for the rest of the street. So I again thank you all for the hard work. I think that it's obvious a lot of care and attention has gone into this first draft. I do think that a hard cap FAR would go a long way to really making sure that we can have flexibility in design and make sure people can have the kind of home they want without having something that really looms over the neighbors and changes, you know, that open, neighborly feeling of a street. And with that, I'll yield the rest of my time.
Great, thank you. I am not seeing any more hands raised. Any more comments that from the public? Okay, I know that we do have one item that Anna McGill is going to be reading into the record for us. Anna?
Yeah, thank you. We did receive one public comment letter after 6 p.m. from Marilyn Robinson, so I'll go ahead and start reading that now. Good evening. I am unable to attend tonight's meeting, but would like to be heard sincerely. The residential neighborhood design guidelines for our town needs to have limits. These homes, like those of Thomas James and the like, are too big for a fair city. Homes that take up the majority of the parcel then require dedicated open space in more neighborhoods, and since we don't have the ability for that, then we need to make sure there's open space around the property on the parcel. A limit to 2 stories and a roof line that does not reach the stars should be implemented, please. These guidelines need to hold the integrity of the neighborhood architectural styles and characteristics with sizing included. I will say it again, I am in favor of a 45% hard cap FAR. Redwood City has character and good sized lots for a remodel with addition, but we do not need tear downs that rebuild gigantic homes without much charm on the full lot. Thank you for volunteering and doing the best for all of Redwood City residents. And that's the end of the public comment.
Great, thank you. So this will be my last call for any other public comment on this issue. Not seeing any hands raised, I will be closing the public hearing. Thank everyone for voicing your concerns. We really appreciate getting feedback from the public. And now I want to go into a discussion. So this is open to our committee and commission members. If you will raise your hand when you have, so I can call on, and we can start this discussion going. And none of you are jumping forward. Mr. Ernie Schmidt, Commissioner Ernie Schmidt.
Thank you, Chair Radcliffe. Well, first of all, thank you, everybody, for all the hard work, and always appreciate these study sessions with our colleagues. And I wanted to kick this off. There was a public letter that came in that spoke pretty loudly to me, and it was from a design person who specializes in home designs, Mr. Stewart, and talking about that the documents that we're looking at, you're always looking at individuals who obviously specialize in this, and one particular thing that he had mentioned that the desirable and undesirable graphics that we really didn't take into consideration the designs of homes or massing, etc. And I wanted to just get our colleagues' opinion on that from an architectural point of view and comment on that letter. I'm sure we all read and see how they felt about it.
Okay, great, thank you. Next we have committee member John Stewart. Don, if you want to unmute yourself and. There you go.
I have to admit that my son Jason wrote that other letter, and he and I have a firm in San Carlos, and he's been working for me for 10 years, and I've been doing residential design for 38 years, and we work in all 22 different communities in San Mateo County, and we've all of them almost have guidelines and design review committees, and we both feel that Redwood City should have a design review committee rather than leaving it to a planner. Nothing against planners, but if there was a committee of architects that weren't linked up particularly with the city, I think we might get more robust comments on design review. So that's one of the things that both of us feel. The other thing is that, to me, style means so much as far as blending into the community and so on. And in this document, it's in the back rather than being in the front. So I'd like to see that reversed and put style up front. The design review committee could be 3 to 5 people. And in San Carlos, for instance, one of the members of the planning commission rotates and is part of it, which I think is a good idea. A couple of references you might want to put in are a Field Guide to American Houses by Virginia Savage McMasters. In our office, we call it the Bible. There's another book that Jason's been using recently called Get Your House Right. And it's by Marianne Custado and Richard Sammons. And if you put reference books in your guidelines, it can really expand upon the principles that you're trying to emulate. As Ernie was saying, we think the text is pretty good, but the graphics really could use some help because a lot of the graphics don't really promote the ideas that go along in the text. And maybe photos versus those kind of cartoonish drawings might be better.
Great.
Our whole emphasis is to pick a style and study the elements that make that style. For instance, roof pitch, window style, type of windows, the trim, the materials, the details that make it that style. And then pick a style and make it look authentic. We wanted our projects to look like they've always been there. They'll make it stand out, make it fit in, make it charming and inviting, make them custom rather than just, the same thing over and over again. We believe small houses are often better because you have more money to spend on unique details. This is such a great city, and I hate to see projects like that one on Iris. That's just beyond the pale. And then the whole trend, like to the black and white farmhouse that you see everywhere. So to me, at least, it seems like those houses are going to be dated within 5 or 10 years, and you'd be a lot better off picking a traditional style or contemporary if you can do it in a way where it's not overpowering. Hillsborough has a really good set of guidelines if you want to take a look at somebody else's guidelines. I'm going to pass this by the local AIA and get their input. And one thing, I like detached garages myself. But I understand that the new ADU ordinance is going to allow second floors over a garage. And if you got a whole city full of detached garages, that means that everybody's up in a corner looking into the neighbor's yard. So maybe somebody can address that. But those are my comments. I think it's a good start, but it still needs some more work. And I'd prefer to see it come back through this joint committee if we could, rather than just going directly to the planning commission.
Great.
So
Thank
thanks
you.
for your time.
Thank you, John. And will you send the references that you made to William so that he has those and can include them?
Yeah.
That'd be great.
No problem. Thank you. Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you. Okay. I am looking for some hands here. Committee member Mark Finger. Now I know I just messed up your last name.
Well, you know, you wouldn't be the first. When my dad volunteered to join the Army during the 60s, the Army put Pieflinger on his uniform, and they never let him change it to the proper spelling. So, being the Army, it's Fenninger. But it is a hard one. I always joke my parents should have bought a vowel.
Yes, you're right.
I'll probably have more comments, but one thing I wanted to sort of to start off is to kind of there was a smaller meeting with some of us to go over this, and I think members Schmidt, Bondano, myself, and Sportano looked at this, and one of the things we talked about was, and I'm going to personalize it from my point of view and not say that this was their point of view, was the prior draft seemed to talk a lot about pattern. And from my point of view, and I thought I heard others, it seemed to really emphasize we should be repeating existing patterns. And one of the discussions we got into is maybe the guidelines should be more about allowing houses to relate to existing patterns, and in the process create new ones.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I think the best example I can think of is a musical one. If anyone knows classical music, and if you don't, listen to the Goldberg variations by Bach. It starts off with one pattern, and then he gives you 31 different ways of, varying off of that pattern. And they're all beautiful. None of them are the same. And I just to bring that up is our discussion was about in my opinion, the guidelines should allow for change. They should allow for houses to get bigger as they need to, but it should be incremental and not sudden. And it should be in a way that relates to neighbors in the neighborhood and feels like it is joining the neighborhood.
Right.
And I showed some pictures at that meeting of houses that are examples of two-story houses sitting right on the front setback, and they look quite nice. And we quickly realized it all lies in the detailing, the way you can break up the mass through detailing, the way you can, it's not just purely a mass question. Oftentimes it is, but sometimes there's numerous houses all over this that have single-story houses around them that half the house is right on the setback, but they're quite gorgeous with their detailing, that they appear as if they've been there for a long time, and some of them have. So I think that's just one thing I'd like to make sure the guidelines hang on to, this idea of allowing for change, incremental change. I would argue for. I think I've heard a lot of people say, and Ernie, to respond to one of your questions, I do think the drawings still need work. I still think the drawings are not quite there yet, but I think the spirit of what we talked about is there, and I think if we can get that spirit into this guideline, we could have something quite good. That's all I have for now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Schmidt?
Well, again, thank you very much. So I wanted to make sure, and maybe Mark can also talk about this as well, because I know we've talked, one of the things that we're always looking for, and we've talked about many times from a planning commission perspective, is how do we make it easy for applicants and architects and home designers to be able to look at something and say, yeah, that's what they're looking for, in this particular neighborhood or as a whole in Redwood City. And that's why Mr. Stewart's letter was refreshing to read, only because of the fact that, are we missing something? Because he obviously looked at it and found, this is not as clear as I would like it as a home designer to be able to understand what Redwood City really wants, from these guidelines. So I guess I would go back to Mark and ask him as well, is there merit to this? Instead of the drawings, should we have more pictures as an example, with comments on the bottom, well, this is desirable, this is what we would be looking at, and this is not something what we would be looking at.
Yeah, I think the more visuals, the better. So, Committeeman there. You told me how to say your last name.
Fenninger. It's okay. Yeah. I Ernie, I think you suggested almost what I was thinking, is if there's a way we could get, and this will be a real hard challenge, but if there's a way we could get, real examples into the guidelines of how you can do it or how you should not, might be the best, rather than trying to invent generic ones, because you can always go look at the real example if you really want to know.
Right.
And we did sort of leave this one of our meetings saying, there are great modern houses that look like they're of today, built in Redwood City, but let's make sure the best ones are what's in this guideline is what we want. And because there's also some, ones that aren't so good and don't fit in with their neighbors. And I could totally understand why someone would want to be able to tell that designer, look at this great example over here. Why can't you make it more like that?
Yes, and I would like to caution all of us that when we pull something that we feel is a bad example, that we not pick on any residents within our city limits, but we go to another city. Because the homeowner may not agree with us. William, you wanted to make a comment, William Chu?
Yes, thanks, Chair Radcliffe. And you kind of took the words out of my mouth. We were very deliberate to not include photos of Redwood City properties because, the language in there about desirable, undesirable, there's definitely varying opinions on that. We didn't want to use Redwood City Redwood City examples. But we can definitely, just going with the discussion here, we can definitely continue to refine the diagrams, potentially look for photographic examples instead of diagrams in some places where it might be appropriate. But at the same time, I do also want to clarify that I think the diagrams themselves, they're specifically addressing that particular guideline on that page or that particular topic. But overall, the design guidelines work together, as committee member, AAC member Fenninger said, that it's about massing, but it's also about detail. So it's the entire guideline document works together as a whole. So it wouldn't just be massing that particular diagram. We would also look at the window details, the garage design, all that stuff together.
Perfect. Thank you, William.
Sorry, and sorry, can I add one more thing?
Absolutely.
Yes, I just wanted to mention that the meeting that committee member Fenninger mentioned was a subcommittee that we put together with the previous chair and vice chair of the Planning Commission, which was Commissioner Schmidt and Commissioner Bondano, and also the AAC chair and vice chair, Spaterno and Finnegar. And so that was a meeting that we did to kind of further talk about the design guidelines and further clarifying certain elements of the design guidelines.
Great. Thanks for clarifying that for everyone. I knew that, but probably quite a few of the committee and commissioners did not. So thank you for clarifying that. Niles, you have your hand raised.
Yes, single family residential detached homes are always such a controversial thing to try and get one's head around in terms of design, because I think there has forever been this issue of style as opposed to design. It's sort of like in the past, American cars had a great reputation for having different styles every year, as opposed to classic European cars that were designed. And homes, I think, fall into the same category. So we end up getting hung up with the details of style as opposed to design. And it's a conversation that is very difficult to have if somebody has an experience that doesn't lend itself to how they approach a project. If they approach a project cosmetically, as design, trying to meet a set of definitive guidelines that they say, well, look, I met the FAR, or I met the setback, or I met the roof height. All those things could be met, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good design. I think that the revised guidelines that we reviewed this evening I like the organization. I think a person who doesn't have a lot of experience can go through it and start to get a sense of the difference between what might be style as opposed to good design. And and it is a rabbit hole that we could keep going down of trying to further and further define. And in the process, we start moving towards the design by metric as opposed to design by design. And it's a difficult gray area to try to meet. So while I agree with comments about it's a good start, my concern would be how much further do we move and it starts becoming really more prescriptive as opposed to a better sense of it being design, which people can accuse of being subjective, but design can be defined, and we all know it when we see it. So I think staff has done a really good job reorganizing the guidelines, and maybe there are some clarifications in each one of the categories to help communicate the goals. And the only comment I had was in styles, I think you could find a better photograph of a Craftsman home than the one that's in there. But other than that, I think it's a much improved document than what we've reviewed previously. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Schmidt.
Thank you, Chair Ratcliffe. Just real quick, just going back, I wanted to thank William for his comments in regards to the graphics and photos. That is an excellent point that I didn't even think about. And I think at the end of the day, even if we kind of lean towards the graphics that that we're looking at now, planning staff or whoever the applicant means at the end of the day should be able to adequately describe and explain to the applicant, what we're looking at here. So thank you for those comments, William.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Bondano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let's see, a couple comments that I wanted to make. Let's see if I can start by getting a little bit more pointed to staff's questions that are on the screen. I would agree that this revision of the draft is better than the first, which is good. I think we did move the needle. Is it absolutely perfect? Probably not yet. And one might be able to argue, could we ever get to pure nirvana and perfection? But in terms of organization, I do believe that this is organized in a better way. I think it's more understandable. I thought it was interesting that, and I don't know if it was who made the comment, but maybe it was John Stewart, about putting the examples of style up front, reorganizing that might be helpful, but at least its sections can stand on their own. And then to flexibility. So actually in this iteration, I think what we were trying to attempt in gaining more flexibility as opposed to getting super black and white and too prescriptive about it. How that showed up in this iteration was a couple of those diagram examples where you saw that there's a little bit more of a scale. So it wasn't so binary. It wasn't, this is what's desirable and this is what's undesirable. And in the last iteration, we had 3 options, and we're like, well, how do you describe that thing in the middle? I think the discussion in our last study session was the thing in the middle could be desirable, it could be undesirable, but it's all in the execution, and it's all in the details, and it's all in, is there enough articulation or fenestration in that one particular quick diagram that was presented, somewhat two-dimensional perspective there. So in that regard, I think we've added in some of that flexibility. Is that ultimately going to help? I hope so. I don't know if that causes too much subjectivity, but I think that they can kind of see there is a scale, and the closer I get to one end, maybe the more easier it's going to be for people to kind of consume, etc. So we go into these other questions. Is there enough now with the building massing and design? Again, I think we certainly have made improvements, but as I'm sitting here, I'm now realizing that the document, in my opinion, the document is really only going to be really helpful and beneficial to anyone who's going to try and consume this thing, if and when someone at the counter, like staff, is actually going to sort of kind of walk them through this or discuss this with an applicant. This is not something where an applicant walks up and says, I want to submit a proposal or an application, a project, and someone just sort of hands them this guideline and say, here's your homework assignment, go off and read this and come back and we can talk about it. Ultimately, honestly, I think this is going to essentially live or die by the fact of how it's presented and how it's discussed in a conversation that planning staff will have with applicants. And with that in mind, actually, if you could, if we could go back a couple slides, and I think it's the slide that's titled "How to Use" for a moment, because I have a couple comments and then some questions there. Yes, this slide. Thank you very much. So really, I guess most of this is directed toward to William Chu. I appreciate this. And then this whole portion of the second bullet about being proactive. Again, I just can't see us handing them a sealed envelope and say, go read this document. It's really going to be this conversation and talking through it. This is why we have these guidelines. This is what we're really kind of after, and that's what's going to, I think, affect better projects, better, more acceptable, more compliant projects is probably the situation there. And this leads me to a couple quick questions about process. Whatever the adopted guidelines might be, I'm kind of looking to say, hey, this project review, the second sub bullet, evaluate each of the guidelines in relation to the project. And someone initially, staff's going to start making some judgments and evaluations on whether or not it does it comply, not apply, comply, or is it not applicable. And there's going to be some back and forth, and they're going to provide this response to the applicant. And I love that last sub bullet, that recommendations for compliance. And what I'd like to know and ask is are we anticipating that after some sort of guidelines are adopted, projects get submitted, this conversation takes place? Whenever a project were to come before either the Planning Commission or the Architectural Advisory Committee, for that matter, what I'd love to see is in the presentation of an application, I'd love to see discussion. I'd like to see what in fact were those recommendations that were made. Here's things that don't readily comply. Here's the recommendations that were made to the applicant. And I'd like to actually see an assessment on whether or not the applicant took to those recommendations. Because what I'm looking for is, are the applicants receiving and taking to and trying to adapt the feedback that the document or city staff is trying to provide them? So that was a lot in there, but I'm kind of looking at, is it going to be perfect? It probably won't be perfect. Therefore, are we going to be able to have some insight into what was discussed, what was proposed, what was actually taken as feedback, and what was dismissed?
Yeah, I certainly think that's a really good idea. So, I mean, the city would typically, after that first review, would issue a comment letter. And so right now it's a completeness check of like what else we need to see in the drawings, maybe some design suggestions. But in the future, once design guidelines are adopted, yeah, we definitely could list each design guideline we found to be not in compliance, and then the recommendations or suggestions that that would make it, consistent with design guidelines. So that's certainly something that we could include if it ends up in the Planning Commission's review.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chu. And if I could, Madam Chair, one more thing. The topic of floor area ratio, or FAR, has been brought up this evening. And just to be clear, we know that that's not what we're discussing this evening. FAR is a different topic. It's a different item. Although I'll just say that, when staff is looking at projects, they really need to be kind of looked at holistically. So I guess, again, my question to Mr. Chu is, what I'm hoping is that when the conversation is happening between planning staff and an applicant, that if it were to apply, right, we want to make sure we do right by the applicant as well as right by the existing built environment and those living there, so that we make sure that we communicate holistically all the different things that might particularly apply, even though they're two separate tools in the toolbox, right? But that's we don't lose sight of all of that. And I guess the quick question is also, because I think it's later this year, so how much more time do we have before the FAR comes back to us just for consideration?
The exact timeline, we're not sure, but hopefully mid 2021 or end of 2021. So the idea is to get the design guidelines to a point where it's ready to adopt. We also want to look at we also want to present the architectural permit findings, the revised architectural permit findings, and then on that separate track is the conversation on FAR and other code updates. So all to come, but the exact timeline we're still trying to figure out, but it kind of depends on how far we get on the design guidelines.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
But just to clarify, William, we do have a soft cap at 45 FAR?
The current floor area ratio ordinance is a soft cap threshold. So it states that if a project is under 3,000 square feet, or if it's 45% or more, whichever is the larger number, that's a staff level review. And then any projects that are over that threshold is reviewed by planning commissions. That's currently the FAR ordinance. And we'll be revisiting that as part of this process.
Perfect, perfect. So we do have that already as a guideline. It's just not a firm one yet. So thank you. Commissioner Hunter.
Thank you. So I agree with many of the other speakers so far that I think this draft is much improved from the last one. I'm very glad that this draft is emphasizing massing and building placement along the street front, and that it's reduced the emphasis, not eliminated it, but reduced the emphasis on neighborhood patterns and architectural styles. I don't want to be a homeowners association and force all the houses to be the same style and the same color palette. I lived in a homeowners association and didn't much like it. But we all know that there's some homes that either in size or design are so out of place that they just shouldn't be built. And I think that's what a lot of, that's really what a lot of our efforts are going toward. I think the goal is to find a balance between not allowing eyesores that detract from their neighborhoods versus giving homeowners the flexibility they need to meet their family's needs. And I think that's a tough needle to thread, but I think these draft guidelines have done a pretty good job. I have some, my specific comments and questions are as follows. So first on the idea of the staff incorporating these into revised architectural permit findings and coming back to us. I think that is a good idea, and that sounds like the best way for how to enforce these guidelines. One question I have, and not to be answered tonight necessarily, but we need to think about this, is that the staff report says, and I like the language, but the idea is that a proposed project would be approved if it, quote, substantially complies with the guidelines. And I just wonder, and this will be a issue for the city attorney and for the staff to noodle out. I just wonder if a term like substantially complies needs to be further defined. We don't want to create a checklist where bad projects can be approved simply because they check each box, as sometimes happens. But we do want the rules to be specific enough and understandable enough that they're actually enforceable. I will take a little bit different opinion on the question about these drawings in the draft. I like the drawings of the undesirable versus desirable examples, especially in the building massing and building design sections. As I looked at the drawings, they really helped to clarify for me, what is a good example and what is something like, okay, now I understand why this kind of proposal is bad, because it's been presented next to a good design, and I can see that the two houses may be similar size, but one is just unacceptable, I think, in a neighborhood context, by its massing and its placement, and the other one really adds to the neighborhood. So I think by using the sketches, which are they're crude and just sketch and just emphasize several details, but I think that's a really good way to emphasize that, okay, this one detail makes this project from a bad one to a good one, or vice versa. So I like having these examples of desirable and undesirable, or the more, the middle, and the less desirable, because they emphasize, each of those emphasizes one particular aspect that we want to focus on. One of the commentators, one of the letters we got today from Ms. Lynn, asked if we could include minimum second story setbacks, either as a fixed amount or as a percentage of the first story dimensions. And I think that's worth considering. I don't know whether that's a good idea or not, but it sounds like a reasonable idea to consider, whether there should be, quantitative guidelines for minimum second story setbacks. As Mr. Stewart said in his letter here, I do agree that the garage design section under building design is less helpful than the other sections. And also, I remember as Niles pointed out at our last joint meeting, he pointed out that the two single car garage doors are much more expensive to build than one double door. And I think we need to keep that in mind also. And that leads me to another comment I have about cost. And I know Ms. Chu in her comments talked about that. And this is something I brought up the last time too, that in the building details, the first guideline says to use high quality building materials, and it gives some examples. And of course, we all want high quality design and we want things to look nice. But generally, high quality materials cost more. And so I think that it needs to be balanced against the higher cost. And I'd actually be interested in hearing from some of the AAC members tonight, some of their thoughts on quality versus costs. Are there particular ways to design and build houses that are high quality and use high quality materials for an affordable cost to the homeowner? Just a couple other things. I like the emphasis in the window design. I like the emphasis on privacy and offsetting windows. That is very helpful. And the last thing is in the next steps. Mr. Shu, you talked about at our next, are you proposing, I think that for our next meeting, you might present us with a final draft that we would then, I guess, vote on, but you would present us with a first draft of proposed architectural permit findings. And I'm thinking that shouldn't those two things be presented and voted on together? Seems like really the architectural permit findings depends on the guidelines.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. I think we're going to have to discuss internally the timeline for all these the next meeting, but we definitely do want the planning commission to weigh in and see how the revised architectural permit findings would relate to the design guidelines. So we definitely want that feedback, but we'll discuss that timeline internally.
Okay, great. Thank you, and that's all I have.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Hunter. Commissioner Martinez?
Thank you, Chair. Quickly, I just wanted to echo the comments of my colleagues. I thought that this document was much easier to pick up and read. I thought that the use of examples of desirable massing of facades and incorporating rationale behind what was an undesirable design, might help avoid delays when folks are trying to implement a new pattern or a new style into a neighborhood. But in terms of just other edits that I had thought about, I think that on that point of having a sliding scale of desirable versus undesirable designs, it might be helpful to expand on the best practices of maintaining privacy with the Windows design section, just because it's such a frequent concern. And I think it would be more helpful if our residents could pick up this document and find a list or some illustrations of window designs that were helpful when they were working to address those concerns with their affected neighbors. And then on that, on another suggestion here, I thought that maybe there could be more emphasis on sustainable building materials, but also green building practices, especially since we'd be following the City Council's lead with their decision on REACH codes. And so those are just some of the things that stood out to me.
Great, thank you. Any other comments? Commissioner Shu.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me now. I actually had a little bit of a Zoom problem there, but I'm back now. I can still hear everyone. I have a quick question for staff before I begin. For the previous iteration in our review, I submitted a very detailed set of comments, which due to Brown Act, I cannot share prior to the meeting with our other participants. But the question I had was, once submitted in that manner to staff as part of the public record, would we have the ability to encourage for any one of our participants who submit written comments, the ability to obtain those comments after the meeting for review? A question for staff.
Hi, Commissioner Stewart. Are you asking whether you can share or whether we can share your formal project comments with the public?
Well, they are part of the public record, as I
Right.
understand it, once they're submitted. But one of the key things I found frustrating was the inability to truly communicate all of the issues or questions I might have had, and to just share the benefit of all the thinking that each of us has if we've submitted written comments. So my basic question was, like, I have 5 pages or so of comments today. I don't intend to read them all. Of course, I want to highlight some. But if I submit them as a public record as written comments, would not it be possible to share them with all the participants of our meeting tonight? So
I see.
Each person who may have submitted as written comments as well would have the benefit of everyone else's full written comments in addition to their verbal comments.
I understand. Yes, that would be possible.
Okay, that would be great, because I think I suspect a number of people might want to know, given the fullness of some commentary that may be submitted, what else was addressed in a written comment that wasn't addressed in a verbal comment. So to keep things moving, I will reiterate that I submitted quite a detailed set of comments and critiques for our first draft, and I appreciate the fact that staff responded so positively to so much of it, and that some of the things that I requested, both verbally and in writing, have been addressed. One of the things that's actually somewhat difficult about these meetings, even though they are beneficial in being joint meetings, is there are so many participants and so little time. It's difficult to get all your thoughts in. But let me start basically with a couple of highlights. I went back and looked at the Stewart letter, and I think it was very valuable. It's one of the most difficult things to do in a set of draft design guidelines, is to have good pictorial examples as well as good illustrations or diagrams. And a lot of his comments are still very apropos. That was one of my main focuses the last time. Is we actually can't expect people to design well if our examples or our diagrams are not extremely good in terms of being a basic guide. If they're not, what I used to experience as a planner as well was that someone would say, well, that's what you showed me. I designed it after your illustration, but the illustration was bad design. And we don't want that. To the big picture question, I would like to note on the staff report, I think there's a little bit too much of a generalization on page 3 of 6. I think we know what we're talking about with the last bullet at the top of page 6 says that staff and our consultant revised the guidelines in response to a general sensibility that requiring overall neighborhood patterns is just too rigid. I'd like to offer at least a slightly different perspective on that. One of my comments was that requiring consistency for apparently consistency's sake of roof lines and eave lines and finished floor elevations, I thought was also, it was not necessarily leading or understandable for good design. It just seemed to be consistency for consistency's sake. And in that respect, I agree with that general observation. But for maintaining patterns of predominant architectural styles, valuable historical context, the types of frontage massing that the second draft guidelines speak so well to, patterns of detached garages and the like, maintaining consistency of those types of patterns, depending on your terminology, that is still appropriate and doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be undue rigidity. And to give you an example, even within the arts and crafts or craftsman style, if you look around our older historical value neighborhoods, you will find very little repetition of design. You will find immense variability in the expression of these styles. You will find mixes and matches of various style elements that you would not necessarily have thought of, but they still work. So I'm thinking, I wanted to offer that perspective on one thing that was in the staff report, because flexibility is always going to be expected within designs, within design styles, within various ways of interpreting the guidelines. I don't ever doubt that we will have flexibility and variability in design. So one of the other things in the staff report, policy discussion topics, middle of page 5 of 6. A previous observation I made and a recommendation does not seem to have found its way into this draft, and I wanted to reemphasize it. Staff, you don't feel the need to respond to every one of these for time's sake, but the design guidelines have to include some kind of a guideline or policy encouragement for retaining the frontage of a historical or architecturally significant home, especially in historic influence neighborhoods, where a second story or two-story addition to the rear may be integrated without demolishing the entire building if the building itself is highly exemplary for its style and the neighborhood's character. And in fact, if you look around many of our older neighborhoods, you will see exactly this type of pattern. And Mrs. Holt's comments spoke to it. There are numerous examples throughout Mount Carmel and other historical value neighborhoods. And whether it's accidentally done or whether it's simply for cost effectiveness, that sort of thing, virtually nothing goes further to maintaining the character of these areas while still allowing significant additions, flexibility in floor area. Because when you demolish the entire house to rebuild it, my observation is it's fairly rare that the replacement home, even if it's intended to be done in a historical style, is quite as good. And there are some good examples, but most of the time, the new home somewhat misses the mark. Another key policy discussion that I think is important in the adopted and still effective guiding principles for the city and the city's policy, there's a significant discussion about using contextual setbacks where appropriate to maintain street frontages and manage the apparent mass of a new home from the street. I didn't see it in this document. I think it is still an important guideline, not necessarily inflexible, but it's an important guideline that needs to be included here with flexibility in some cases where the lot requires it, or to provide for a very significant usable porch area, etc. But this is a significant issue in the city right now, because as I go all over the city and look at examples of new homes, it seems fairly hit or miss as to whether or not contextual setbacks are being used. But the places you really notice it are where a very large and sort of obtrusive two-story design has been allowed to be placed at the 15-foot front setback, when it's the exact type of large massing that should have been improved through such guidelines as are before us tonight, as well as a 20-foot setback. So that gets to placement, and placement doesn't get that much discussion in these guidelines. Under the purposes statement on page 2 of our guidelines, one of the things I've heard from AAC members and planning commissioners alike that is missing here, and that is that there should be a purpose statement or a bullet to encourage true integrity of design and authenticity of expression for any particular architectural style once chosen to be implemented. In other words, be true to the style, the fundamental design elements that make the style, and still be allowed to have some individual expression within it in terms of the various facade treatments. But that is a key component that I heard at our last joint meeting that I think needs to be reemphasized, because pardon my French, but bastardized versions of historical styles are not good design. One of the other things that I think is important is, and throughout this document, there are often references to living space under the roof or within an attic space, or references to what are essentially called half-story or 1.5-story designs. Very common for arts and crafts styles, but it's rarely referred to as a half-story, which is the actual correct term. You either have an attic or you have conditioned space within that attic space, which means it's a half-story. On guideline 2G, I think there's a minor clarification here I'd like to request again. The term is used in guideline 2G, refers to quote unquote secondary forms, but there are no examples or no further definition of what it is that the guidelines really mean here. I would like to reiterate my request for an example or something to be shown there. What would the average user understand that to mean? Under the same heading in that portion of the guidelines, under the second desirable example on page 7, there's a phrase or a statement made that I find, even as a planner and son of an architect, I find it very confusing. What does it mean for a second story to engage with the ground floor? I think those types of sort of artsy sounding concepts I would like to hear more about from any member of our architectural committee, but there are a few of those sprinkled around, such as the roof design, trying to give some indication of what the program of living space is below. I don't really see the value of those types of guidelines. They don't inform me what's intended to be achieved, and I think they're kind of bizarre in a way to think that a roof is intended to in some way indicate whether there's a bedroom or a bathroom or a rumpus room or something in the area of living area below it. I'm moving on now to building design, and I'll try to move through these fairly quickly. Under building design, this section again discusses elements of design while seemingly avoiding discussing the equally important aspect of elements of style. I understood some of the comments made previously, but I think it's very important for us to understand many people approach the design of a single family home in a very functional way, and many who particularly consult an architect will base their desires on their understanding of a desired style. We need to be cognizant of and not avoid a discussion of the importance of styles, not necessarily whether we are being absolutely prescriptive about styles to be chosen, but when a style is a key component of how a home's going to be designed, you can't simply ignore it by talking about you have design elements. Styles are made up of design elements. In the last sentence in the first paragraph of this section, it states that building design elements can create a cohesive and unified style and building envelope. I think the statement is incorrect. The building envelope is a term that refers to the area on the lot that can be occupied by a home by dint of the regulations of height, story limits, setbacks, and lot coverage. So design elements don't create a building envelope or contribute to a building envelope. I think the term is misused there. So moving on to facades real quickly. There's a fairly significant trend in many areas in Redwood City today where a porch has been included, or an covered entry has been included in the design. But the way it's integrated into the roof plan results in a somewhat fragmented, stunted porch roof design, doesn't integrate well, and has peculiar geometry. This is often because the porch itself is tacked on like an appendage rather than well integrated. I think we maybe need to beef up a guideline about the porch roof concept here, because it is a very common failing, in my opinion, in a number of newer home designs. Another aspect of roof design I would like to point to is that we need a guideline that cautions against the unnecessary mixing and jumbling together of too many different types of roof forms, particularly in larger new homes, in an apparent attempt to limit overall appearance of building mass. When you do this on a large home with 4 or 5 different roof forms that don't come together in natural geometric ways, all you get is irregular geometry and goofy looking roof forms. And so I think we need to have simplified roof designs that use consistent roof forms. Again, one of the commenters discussed many commenters discussed detached garages. I would like to point out that it's an existing current guiding policy that where neighborhoods and blocks have predominant detached garages. The detached garage option should be the first choice or default, with the fallback that an option may be allowed to have an attached garage due to lot characteristics, tree preservations, particular design issues, or what have you. And it should be done, if it's attached, in a way to minimize its obtrusiveness and not be a focal point of the frontage that's been stated. Another minor comment that I don't understand, and I still fail to understand how it be here, minimizing garage width. If you have a standard 2-car garage, the garage opening is standardized throughout the industry. You can customize them, but generally they're standardized for vehicle access. Design and facade may be the best way to help reduce mass. Under building materials, under 4A, I think still the most important thing to do is use quality materials appropriate to the style and design. Quality materials that are not appropriate to a particular style simply does not result in good design, no matter how costly or particularly well done they are. Under 4D, it says using different facade treatments to distinguish first and second story homes. I think this is rarely results in good design, and some of the most unappealing looking homes in many neighborhoods that I've seen use this type of thing, where they use stone for part of the upstairs, stucco on the rest, scattered stone appearances on the lower. One home has a purple second story. These are not good design, better through these aspects of design elements. And then lastly, under landscaping, It's a question for staff as well. I have a lot of questions about this, but in my understanding, a landscape plan is typically now, due to state law, going to be a component of a conditional approval for water conservation and landscaping. And there are many ways now that different types of landscaping, xeriscapes, succulent gardens, various things like that, cactus gardens are used. They don't necessarily mean they're going to be consistent across a neighborhood, but they're preferred in some ways for water conservation. And they're not spoken to. I made one last comment as well on landscaping the last time, that the exhortation to maintain existing landscaping at all costs is not clear or understandable. I don't understand why. I'll give you a good example. Many older homes have unkempt, overgrown, poorly managed, improper landscaping that needs to be all completely taken out and redone in accordance with good guidelines. So the concept of just under 5A, maintain existing landscaping does not ring true to me, particularly in case of my own home, where the house was so overgrown with 70 years of volunteer trees and vines that you could hardly see the house. There's no reason to maintain such landscaping. You need to improve upon. So I will be happy to submit my written comments. These are just some of the flavor of the comments that I have so far. I do believe very much that we are looking at least a 50% improved document in terms of your organization, in terms of the various improvements that are made. There can still be some significant improvement. And we do need also, finally, we need to understand the differentiation between preservation and transformation. If you look at all the goals of the general plan and their related policies, the thrust of the general plan is for there to be appropriate preservation and retention of neighborhood character. And that's one of the reasons I asked for them to be there in the draft preamble of this guidelines. So we all have them to refer to. In some neighborhoods, provide more opportunity for flexibility than others. And I think that's a tension everyone recognizes. But if neighborhoods such as Mount Carmel or other historical neighborhoods are allowed to be essentially have every older home replaced with a contemporary home over time, you simply won't have the same outcome. You won't have the characteristics that drew people to it or that people think of when they think of desirable neighborhoods such as these. So thank you for your patience and your time. Those are my comments, and I'll be submitting the rest of them in writing. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Shu. Any other comments from committee members, commissioners? Okay, seeing none, I just have one comment because all of my other comments were already covered by previous speakers. Under our architectural styles, chapter 6, almost every single picture that we have for showing the architectural styles are 2 stories, which I think it would be helpful if we had a 2-story and a 1-story of each style, so that someone going into adding the 2nd story to a 1-story could relate to their 1-story and seeing how it could be. So if we could get a little more variety in our graphics. And I found the line drawings very, very clear and helpful, because they really honed in on whatever issue we were looking at. For instance, the graphics on the windows, it was very clear what you were trying to get across, versus using a picture, which I think could, get people a little confused with other elements and stuff. So those are my comments for you guys. William, do you feel that you have received enough feedback from everyone?
Thank you. No, absolutely. We received a lot of good feedback and comments tonight.
Great. Okay, so this is going to be my last call, you guys, for any more comments from the committee or commission. Okay, seeing none, we will go on to matters of commission interest. Oh, Mr. Shu.
Oh, well, thank you for recognizing me. I just realized one of the things that when you bring back the potential revisions to the architectural permit provisions, one of the things that strikes me, and I think when people talk about needing more flexibility, is that it appears based on the wording today that any amount of second story floor area that's added would trigger discretionary review through an architectural permit, the same as if you were building an entirely new two-story home. So one of the ways of providing some flexibility might be to consider whether or not there's a minor amount or minor project definition, minor amount of floor area that might either be exempt or eligible for some type of administrative review without discretionary review. So I don't just to put that out there as an idea, because it's very common in my experience that 40 square foot addition on the second floor is vastly different impact, especially if it's in the rear, to a whole new two-story home. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Commissioner Chu. Okay, back to matters of committee commission interest. Ms. McGill, I believe that would be you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so just a quick reminder before we go to the tentative agenda again. March 2nd will be our next meeting, and we will be transitioning to using video in our virtual conference. And so you will put your video on while you're speaking, commissioners, as well as staff. And then you will turn your video off again once you're finished speaking. If you have any questions about how to do that, or you need IT support, please get in touch with me and I can connect you to any support that you need. Also, a reminder to, if you're reaching out to IT, to please talk to them about getting your picture up. I know some are still having some technical difficulties with doing that, and so IT can help make sure that your picture is up during the meeting. So moving on to the tentative agenda, March 2nd, you will see the annual housing progress report on consent, and then we'll be having a study session about the regional housing needs assessment and some timeline discussion on the housing element update. March 16th, anticipating 240 Twin Dolphin, which is a commercial office project, will come before you. And then likely we're anticipating returning in April with a formal review of residential design guidelines for your recommendation. And we will bring the architectural permit findings likely at this time too for a recommendation in conjunction with the residential design guidelines. So as I said before, the next scheduled meeting is March 2nd. And that's it, unless there's any questions.
Perfect. Any questions from committee or commissioners? Commissioner Hunter.
Yeah, thank you. When you bring back the residential design guidelines, I think at least one of the committee members suggested that both the commission and the committee review them, do the formal review at the next session. Is that anticipated, or would it only be the planning commission, or how do you anticipate doing that?
Yeah, it's currently anticipated that it would just be the planning commission because we're doing zoning, where we would be proposing zoning code changes as well, and a formal recommendation that would go to the city council. The joint study sessions is more of a subcommittee, and so we would just bring back the formal recommendation to the planning commission. But we can talk about it internally a little bit more, but I think that that's our recommended approach.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Ms. McGill. Any other announcements from committee or commissioners? Okay, that concludes our action items for tonight's agenda. Our next Planning Commission meeting will be March 2nd, and I bid all of you good night.